All right.
Oh, yes,
Perfect.
great.
Oh, is that sharing now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Sharing.
Oh, that's fantastic.
That's fantastic. That's good. That's good.
So Hazim is the one that's sharing, is it?
No, this is by
Prof. Yeah,
That's right.
that's good.
Professor.
Yeah. Okay,
Okay.
that's good. That's good. Yeah. So I think we have solved the technical problems, and so Simon, you are ready to start?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So maybe just let me to do a very simple introductions of you to colleagues that have come on board for this training sessions, or more like a dialogue and discussion sessions. Yeah. So I would like to apologize first. I will have to run out of this sessions at about 10:30 because I have another meeting to attend to. But before I run off, I would like to do a brief introductions of Simon, and also, a bit of introductions about the purpose of these sessions. And I hope everybody that is here attending these sessions will benefit from these sessions. Yeah. So first of all, thank you very much, Simon. Thank you for, agreed to actually give this very valuable workshops, all sessions, all discussions for our colleagues. And I think within these sessions, we might have some postgraduate students with us as well. Yeah, because we also run some of our own postgraduate programs. So colleagues here, let me introduce Prof. Simon from UOW Australia. I have met Simon, just for a few times over the internet, and we definitely look forward if we can actually have a face-to-face sessions with you. Yeah. So Prof. Simon is actually the Dean for UW Graduate Research School. Yeah. And the purpose of this meeting is that he would like to share with us how is a higher degree or postgraduate by research degree is actually kind of run in UW side. And for colleagues here, since we become part of UW in 2019, the COVID has also stopped us from having a more easy access to UOW global networks. But now, since everything has kind of subsided and we are now going into a post-pandemic era, we are very glad that we finally will have these sessions, and Prof. Simon will tell us more about if you would like to further your study with UW or maybe with anywhere else. What are the things that you can do, and why is a higher degree or research degree will actually improve your life and not just for us as our institutions. It is always very scary, especially for you if you are working and you would like to embark onto a postgraduate degree, because you have to juggle between work and your personal life and the studies. Yeah, so it can be a bit scary, but I would like to assure you that the rewards at the end of it, it definitely will be very rewarding for you as an individual, because the experience will indeed change your life. Yeah. So just want everybody to know that you need to start somewhere. The start might be difficult, but once you start, and you will find the rewards along the journey. And we are really, really glad that, we are part of UW, and UW being a very established public institution in Australia, definitely have a much, larger pool of supervisors as well as support for postgraduate study. So I would really look forward to see more of our colleagues that will embark onto the postgraduate by research at UOW site. And thank you very much, Simon, for doing this session for us. We are taking baby steps, and we definitely really like to know more about doing postgraduate study at UOW and how our colleagues here can start to embark on this journey. Yeah. Thank you, Simon. Over to you.
No, thank you very much. That was an excellent introduction. And so good, in fact, you covered a lot of what I was going to say. So I probably don't need to speak anymore. But look, I will expand on some of the points now, and hopefully some of it will be valuable to at least most of the audience. So I suppose I asked the question, will a PhD really improve your life? And I want to start with just a fun little puzzle. And I've got a few little numbers here, 3.7 years, 3 to 4 times an ordinary paper, 100,000 words, and 1,400. And I thought you might want to guess what those numbers might refer to. I'm happy to look at the chat box. I'll just give you a minute to do that. It's pretty hard to guess, but see how you go. And this is more just designed to introduce some of the key features of a PhD degree, particularly at UAW. But if you haven't guessed, I'll let you know what those numbers refer to. The 3.7 years is basically just the average time it takes to complete a PhD if you're studying full-time. And obviously, if you're studying part-time, which is probably relevant to the majority of you, if you do complete a PhD, it will obviously take about double that time. So although we sort of advertise it to take between 3 and 3.5 years, as you know, most tasks always take longer than we expect. It's called the planning fallacy. It's a well-known discovery, and so you do need to recognise that time. 3 to 4 times an ordinary paper. Well, that basically represents essentially the scope of a PhD. You know, how big is a PhD? How much research do you need to undertake relative to a master's or some other research you've completed before? Well, roughly speaking, although the PhD is up to 100,000 words, so it could be a lot of words, the scope is not huge. It's usually equal to about 3 to 4 times a typical paper in your field. So if you just read a typical, not a top paper, but just a typical average paper in your field, and think about how much research they've conducted, the PhD will normally be about 3 to 4 times the amount of research in data collection, analysis, and interpretation. I mentioned before that the maximum word length is 100,000 words, and that excludes things like appendices and footnotes, but basically it's pretty large. Most PhDs are about 60 to 80,000 words, and so therefore the capacity to write effectively and fluently is one of the key determinants of success. Fortunately, at the university, we've developed many different programs to really help all writers improve their capacity to write professionally, effectively, and fluently, both in English and in a scholarly way. And finally, 1,400 is just basically the number of PhD or HDR candidates actually we have across the entire university, across the suite of UAW campuses. Okay. All right, so here are some of the topics I'll discuss over the next maybe half an hour or so, and then we'll open up time for questions. So, interestingly, my feeling is that a PhD will become increasingly important in the future, regardless of whether you want to remain in academia. And the reason being is that, you know, my sense is, and I'd be interested in your views about this possibility, is that in the future, employers won't really be seeking specialists in a very specific area because the areas and the industries and the domains just shift so quickly, shift so rapidly, that a particular skill that could be useful 1 year might be actually obsolete 5 or 10 years later. So they're not necessarily seeking people who are necessarily specialists, particularly if they want to invest in people in the long term, because our industries are so dynamic and changing. On the other hand, employers aren't really interested in generalists, that is, people who are sort of good at a whole range of tasks either, because, you know, as the technology becomes increasingly advanced, employees will need greater skills to really thrive and be able to utilise that technology, improve the technology, and be of value to the organisation. So if employers are not interested in specialists and they're not interested in generalists, roughly speaking, what are they interested in? Well, my sense is they'll be interested in individuals who specialise in being flexible, who can specialise in coping with the changing technologies and demands and industries that will be common in the future workplace. So what skills are necessary for individuals to be able to specialise in the capacity to be flexible and cope with change? Well, my sense is that employees in particular will be interested in individuals who complete or have acquired these particular capabilities. The capability to really understand new data and information to reach decisions about how to change and improve an organisation. They'll obviously be seeking individuals who can solve problems creatively and who can offer novel solutions to unexpected problems and changes in the industry, problems and changes that will become increasingly common in the future. They'll obviously be interested in people who can communicate persuasively these sort of ideas and recommendations and creative solutions to these problems. They'll obviously be interested in people who can manage the implementation of these solutions, who can manage projects and fund projects effectively. And finally, they'll be interested in people who can sort of communicate and predict and understand the latest trends in society, because the world will be changing so quickly that we need to be able to predict, what events and changes and technologies will need to accommodate in the future. And it just turns out that these 5 qualities are what is really central to a PhD. And I know many of you would have completed like a master's before or something like that, but these qualities are even more honed in the PhD. And it's for that reason that I believe that employees across the globe, including in Asia, in Southeast Asia, but really probably everywhere, and certainly in Australia as well, will be more likely to value the PhD because they recognise that people who complete a PhD will have developed those skills that will become probably increasingly important in the future. Whereas at the moment, many employees regard the PhD as maybe too much being a specialist or an academic, rather than someone who is necessarily practical in the real world. Now, so therefore, is the PhD relevant to you? Well, generally speaking, people complete a PhD for one of 4 reasons. And we call this progress, pivot, promote, and pursue. So you might want to guess what those words might represent here, but I'll let you know anyway. So essentially, some people will complete a PhD simply because they want to become promoted within their existing career path. So for some of you, that might be a promotion in, for example, as a university academic, or if some of you are working in other fields as well, in nursing, education, or whatever it might be, you might want the PhD simply to be promoted to a leadership level. Often the PhD will facilitate that. Some people want to complete a PhD. It's probably not as relevant for you simply because they want to pivot into a research career. Obviously, many of you are in that roles already, but if you're not in a research role, many people think that actually they really like the idea of engaging in research analysis and so forth, and the PhD is obviously a good purpose for that. Some people want to be complete a PhD because they want to promote a new idea, a program, an initiative, a technology, something they really believe in, and they maybe want to become an entrepreneur and even commercialise that idea. And obviously, a PhD provides both the expertise, insight, as well as the credibility to follow that pathway. And finally, some people, particularly when they're a little bit older in life, simply want to complete a PhD because they want to pursue something that's very important to them. They want to explore a question, an issue, or a topic that really resonates with their values and their needs and their interests. And so they really pursue a PhD mainly for interest. Okay. And of course, a PhD will generate many benefits, not just in academia. So, many of you may stay in academia, in which case, obviously, the PhD will be beneficial for promotion. But even outside academia, there are many benefits to the PhD. And these pictures here represent some of those industries. So one of the picture on the top right obviously represents research. So obviously, a PhD is relevant for research jobs. On the top left is a Parliament House. I think that's actually a Parliament House in Australia. But that represents the notion that PhDs are often useful for people who want to work in government, particularly trying to improve policies around how to improve their society and community as well. The bottom left refers to the notion that many PhDs will work in consulting, in providing advice, support in either consulting firms or in their own small businesses. And finally, many PhD individuals will be involved in roles that involve sort of writing like science articles, popular magazines, journalism, and those sorts of things, using their expertise to guide those articles. Okay. So I've sort of described some of the potential benefits of completing a PhD, but what are the drawbacks of completing a PhD? What are some of the challenges you might consider before you sort of reach a decision about whether or not that's a pursuit that you want to consider? So there are probably 3 main sets of challenges or complications you might want to consider. So, firstly, you need to know whether or not you can do it. have you attained the qualifications and also the qualities or capabilities that are necessary to thrive in a PhD. And there's probably just 4 issues to consider around whether or not you've developed the capabilities or qualifications. So first you need to think about whether you're eligible. At UOW, people tend to be eligible if they've completed some research, usually about half a year of research, something like that, at a postgraduate level. So often that's research in masters. It might be research in types of honours degrees, but not many. Some honours degrees are really more regarded as undergraduate. They're part of a 3-year program. But sort of honours degrees that are after a bachelor program that's 6 months of research, that could be counted as well. Or it might be research in an employment situation, for example, as part of your work in your current roles, which is sort of almost equivalent to about at least half a year of good research, like a small thesis. So if you completed that sort of half a year of research, it might be a thesis of about 20,000. It might be 1 paper in which you're the first author, or 2 or 3 papers in which you're not the first author. You may be eligible to apply. And if you're not sure, we can provide some further advice about eligibility as well. So in particular, we will soon have, and it's not quite yet available, a little Excel tool, a little spreadsheet where you can answer some questions and it'll assess whether or not you're likely to be eligible, or you're sort of welcome to speak to someone, and I'll talk about who to speak to later. This slide's not as relevant. It's more about if you're interested in stipends, but stipends or scholarships are really only available, at least initially, if you do study full time. So if for some reason you actually want to study full time, if that's an option for some, and for you, it might be an option for a couple of you, then stipends may be available. They're obviously quite competitive, but they're, we may sort of want to, cater for UAW Malaysia in some way to think about that issue as well. You need to think about fees, but of course, if you're a staff at UAW Malaysia, then actually we do waive fees for your PhD, so you won't need to pay to complete a PhD. And then finally, you need to think about some of your personal qualities. And just as a little exercise, here's just a little fun task. It doesn't look fun. It looks actually quite horrendous. I mean, for the mathematical people among you, it's probably quite straightforward, but for some it might be hard. And it's basically, the question is, how long is that line from X to Y? You can see it's sort of a yellow diagonal line relative to AB. And you might look at that, and some of you might know the answer straight away. Some of you might be able to work it out. Many of you might sort of think, oh, this is definitely not my field. There's no way I'm going to work out that answer. It just looks too sort of strange and obscure. But actually, as it turns out, it's actually very simple. Because if you think about it, that diagonal from X to Y, which should be the same length as the diagonal from Z to the centre. Can you see that? So X to Y should be the same length as Z to the centre, and Z to the centre is just the radius of the circle. And so that yellow line is obviously half the diameter, half the A from A to B. So why did I do that? Why did I give you that exercise? Was it just to make you feel bad? No, it wasn't that. It was more that in some ways we are seeking people, and I think the people who thrive in PhD the most are those that just enjoy analysing ideas, solving problems, not necessarily that sort of problem, but some sort of problem, like thinking. They're actually intrinsically motivated to solve a problem and conduct research, as of course many of you I'm sure are. What my sense is that people who complete a PhD merely for an outcome, merely for a promotion, merely because they have to, they often struggle a little bit. And so you really want to embrace that sense of solving problems, thinking through and challenging yourself and so forth. And you're obviously, to complete a PhD, someone who really needs to be able to work independently, because in some ways the PhD, as you probably would have known from masters or other degrees, it can be a very lonely affair, even more lonely than masters. You're sort of often just doing research in a way that is quite unique, and no one is quite following your pathway or timing, and so you need to be able to work independently. But of course you also need to be able to collaborate with your supervisors and often other colleagues within your research team as well. And of course you need to be able to dedicate the time. Now, if you happen to enrol full-time, you really need to dedicate full-time, at least 4.5 days a week to the HDR, to the PhD, to be able to progress. If you're enrolling part-time, which is probably relevant to the majority of you, then we still want people to be able to dedicate 2 to 2.5 days a week to their PhD. It may fluctuate over time, but that's on average how much they should dedicate. So it sort of really means that it's very hard to complete a PhD if you're going to be working more than 3 days a week. That would take a lot of time. It would mean that too much of your weekend would be used up on the PhD, and that's something you can maintain for a while, but it's hard to sustain for that 6-7 years that a PhD part-time can take. Okay, so the second issue you might need to consider in relation to drawbacks is just the expenses. I don't think that'll be a major issue, but we do happen to have this little Excel sheet also available on our page. So there's on the Graduate Research School, which administers the PhDs for UAW, there is a page for future candidates. It has this little Excel sheet that can help you estimate some of the expenses. But of course, these are expenses only relevant if you happen to want to travel to Australia and live in Australia to complete the PhD. If you're going to be staying in Malaysia, that's very different. It's really just the expenses, the normal living expenses of your life. So you don't really need to worry about this issue at all. And thirdly, you really need to be someone who can navigate your own career path, because as I mentioned before, each PhD is unique, and the implications of that PhD for your career are also quite unique. Of course, if you stay in academia, it's quite straightforward, but if you're going to be utilising the PhD for other purposes, then you have to be someone who has the independence to think about different sorts of career paths and how to pursue that, because it can be quite different to anyone else's life. Okay, so how do you apply? Well, the hardest part of applying is to create like a research proposal, essentially a proposal that summarises the research that you're likely to conduct over the, say, 6 years part-time. So how do you develop this research proposal? Well, I mean, and I'll talk about how in a moment, but you would normally develop a rough research proposal and then contact a supervisor for support. But to give you, just to introduce the notion of a research proposal, I've got 5 cards on the screen here you might be able to see. And what I'd like you to do, and you can write your answer in the chat box if you like, is just to pick one card. Okay, just pick one card, and if you want to, you're happy to write it in the chat box, or you can just remember it as well. Just pick one card. Okay, and this is a strange task, I know, but I'll explain it in a moment. So thank you. The 4th, yep, okay. Well, I'm glad you said that one. As it turns out, and I don't know if this has worked for you, the majority of people, certainly not everyone, but more than 50% of people actually pick the 4. And some pick the 8, but the majority actually pick the 4. And the reason being is that they don't necessarily like to pick the 2 outside ones. It feels a bit too obvious. And they don't want to necessarily pick the middle one. That just seems too symmetrical. And they don't want to pick the 7 because that's the only black card and it just feels like it's too unique. So some reason people pick the 4. Some people pick the king, as you did, and some people pick the ace, but the majority pick the 4. The slight majority. Why is that the case? Well, the truth is that, what was I trying to show? The truth is that it's, part of your research is to find something unique. And you need to, your PhD has to be original, probably more original than a master thesis or another thesis you've completed. And so the question becomes, how do you create a unique research proposal, essentially? And so that's what I'm going to talk about now. It's not as easy to be unique as we think. Sometimes we think we're original, like we think we pick a card that no one does, but we often follow fairly standard patterns. And my sense is it probably takes about 100 hours of time, not necessarily consecutively, but over time, to create a compelling research proposal. And there's a number of ways of doing it. So maybe in the first few hours, you could just list some of the problems in society that are really important to you, but relevant to your discipline, or the controversies in literature in your discipline that you would like to solve. And then you might attempt to combine some of these problems together. And finally, you might think about what the future might be like if these problems were solved or these controversies in literature were addressed. And the reason being is this simple task of combining some ideas and thinking about how the future can be better has been shown to improve creativity and increasing the likelihood that you might think of something quite original. But then, that's probably not enough. Instead, you probably start needing to really find something interesting and creative that resonates with you. You might start, reading some of the websites that actually summarize the latest trends in particular fields. A good one is Science Daily or Reddit or whatever it might be. But in most of these sorts of websites, there are often summaries of the latest exciting developments in a particular field. And even if those developments don't quite align to your research interests or expertise, they can sort of help you think about how your research area could be adapted in a fairly novel and original way. And then the idea is, just to skim these articles very quickly and transcribe some sort of ideas, interesting methods or arguments, very quickly. And that notion of just skimming through lots of interesting ideas very quickly has been sort of shown to potentially activate dopamine in the neurolimbic pathways, part of the brain, that make you just sort of think a little bit more creatively and feel a lot more excited about your ideas. And then, of course, you want to start a proper literature review, maybe using Google Scholar or maybe a scholarly database within your particular area to start searching for words that are relevant to these interests or ideas that you're starting to find intriguing. Reading a few articles in depth. And then, really, I think just to finalise what you're going to do, my sense is that it's not that hard. I sort of usually recommend that what you do is you just find those articles or papers that really resonate with you, that are really interesting, and see if you can combine them together in some way. Using the methods of one to apply to the problem of another, or whatever it might be. But just that attempt to blend those papers that really resonate can generate quite an interesting project. Okay, sorry, just let me go for that. And then you're ready basically to write your proposal. And obviously, after about, it should be maybe 6 or 7 hours, you might write where you just list the key arguments you want to include, and I'll talk about what to include in a moment, and gradually sort these ideas into the various sections. And generally, a research proposal is a bit like a small paper. It'll include a short introduction, a literature review, the methods you want to undertake, the outcomes you predict, and some sort of risks, complications, or caveats that might need to be considered. So let me describe that very quickly. So for the introduction, you would normally begin with the problem in society you want to solve, or some controversy in the literature you want to address. And then have some sort of numbers or facts or insights or observations that just highlight the importance of this problem or the importance of this controversy, to highlight why this problem has been quite difficult to solve in the past. And then you obviously provide a literature review, where you talk about past attempts to solve this problem, the difficulties these attempts have identified, and some empirical evidence to justify these arguments over time. And then you're trying to end with an argument for why this problem hasn't been solved, and that you want to introduce like a unique perspective or approach, maybe just combining other people's methods to solve this problem. All right, and then you provide the methods that you're going to utilise to solve this problem. And as I said, you want to show something novel. That doesn't have to be incredibly creative. It might be, as I say, just a slight shift to an existing method, or it might be combining methods that have never been combined before, or something like that. And using some references to justify these decisions. And finally, you might highlight some hypothetical outcomes that could be generated. Often people don't really understand the importance of your research until they can see what the potential findings, results, or outcomes could be, as well as how other industries might benefit from the research. Increasingly, as you probably know, universities around the world are becoming more and more interested in research that generates a tangible benefit to a community, a society, a workplace, or whatever it might be. And that seems to be something they're prioritising when they're evaluating research proposals. And finally, you need to talk about some of the complications. You might try to estimate very roughly a budget, how much it might cost to conduct some of this research, just to make sure it's not too expensive, that it's something the university can afford. And then you talk about some of the ethical issues, if there are any legal matters such as permissions that might be required, as well as any other sort of physical or safety risks, biosafety and so forth, that may need to be addressed, just to show that you're aware of some of the complications and that you believe that you should be able to accommodate that with the right support. And finally, once you've got these ideas, you start sorting these ideas into clusters to develop a plan of your research proposal. I mean, of course, you're all experienced writers, so you'll have your own way of writing. But I like when I have lots of ideas just to start developing clusters, finding some time to just order those clusters in a nice way before I actually write my actual proposal. And just to give you a sense of ordering and get your mind thinking about how to order concepts, I've got 4 pictures on this slide here. You might know most of these people, like you've got Marilyn Monroe, the actress, Michael Jackson, the singer, Albert Einstein, the physicist, and Barack Obama, former US president. And these are all ordered in a particular way across the slide. And I suppose my question is, can you think of the way they're ordered? Is there any way in there, like, can you think of why I've arranged them in this particular order? You can see they're not ordered by time of birth, because I think Albert Einstein would have been the first. They're not ordered in age, so I don't think that's quite right. So what could it be? Well, as it turns out, I'll give you the answer. It's pretty hard to actually guess. They're actually ordered in terms of height. It turns that Marilyn Monroe is actually the shortest, Barack Obama is the tallest, and the other 2 in between. Now, I only included that exercise, not because it's a particularly good one, but it's just more that we really need to be able to practice ordering our arguments. And it's something that I think is a slightly undervalued skill in academia, where we're not taught how do we order our arguments in such a way that they're most compelling. So, sometimes we might order our arguments chronologically. If we're describing a series of studies, we might start with the earliest and then finish with the latest. But that doesn't necessarily always capture the narrative most effectively, and therefore might not necessarily convince the person who's reading the research proposal. So there are many other ways of ordering. Another way is simply from the simplest arguments to the most complicated, because after you've provided the simplest arguments, people can often understand the more complicated arguments later. But often when you think about it, some other more natural order will come to pass. And there's no right or wrong, but just thinking about that process is very important to creating a good research proposal, as I'm sure many of you would know. And then, I've just got a little bit of information about really, making sure use of your colleagues or anyone else to really optimise the way those research proposals are written. And the reason being is that supervisors, their main concern when taking on a HDR or PhD candidate, as I'm sure many of you have experienced yourselves, is finding someone who just can't really express themselves, because if obviously about 1 year of a PhD is usually dedicated to actually writing the thesis, and although it's a skill that can be developed, if people really struggle to write, it can take so long to develop. It creates a lot of issues for the supervisor. So supervisors can be quite concerned. So you want to sort of be able to develop your writing as well as possible. And there are many programs that can do that. And if you're interested, I'm happy to sort of share some examples of some programs on public websites that just help you write your research proposal, and indeed anything, a little bit more convincingly and compellingly than before. Making sure the paragraphs are structured very well. There's different types of paragraphs, and each can be structured in different ways. And there are certain words you really want to avoid that create some problems. I'll give you a couple of examples. This is just more for fun than anything else. At least I find it fun. Maybe you won't. But here are a couple of sentences, each of which I think could be written more concisely, precisely, and professionally. So, for example, with the sentence, it has been shown that carrots improve intelligence. How could you improve that sentence? What word do you think could be better or changed? How could this sentence be more precise and concise? And you're welcome to try something in the chat box if you think of anything. But really, probably the main problem with that sentence is the word it, which is very vague It's not specific. And so it's hard to imagine what we're referring to. So a better sentence might be, researchers have shown that carrots improve intelligence, or a particular research, it could be John 2020 has shown that carrots improve intelligence. Or you could even omit the phrase, it has been shown that, and just write carrots improve intelligence and include a citation. So the word it is often ambiguous and can either be changed with a more specific term or removed altogether. And similarly, the sentence, this excites people who like carrots and rabbits. What's wrong with that sentence? Which word seems a little bit vague in this sentence, do you think? Is there one word that probably is ambiguous? Well, it's probably the word this. What does this refer to? I'm not sure. And so whenever you write the word this, you should always follow that word with a specific noun or object. It could be this finding excites people who like carrots and rabbits, or this discovery, or whatever it might be. And I won't talk about some of the others, but these other sentences could be improved as well. So people have more confidence. The word have is ambiguous. They experience more confidence, they report more confidence, but you want to be as specific as possible. And sometimes you can use a program like ChatGPT to help you identify the right word if you're struggling to specify a more precise alternative. And with questions like, in terms of foods to eat, you should eat carrots daily. Well, the phrase in terms of is usually redundant. So those first 5 words could be omitted and the argument would sound a lot more sharp. And then finally, the sentence, a number of studies show that carrots improve intelligence, is probably also a bit vague because the phrase a number of could mean anything. It could mean 10, it could mean 100, it could mean -7. So we'd probably want a slightly more precise word. It could be several studies show that carrots improve intelligence, or many studies show that carrots improve intelligence. Or if we know the number, we should say 10 studies or 5 to 6 studies show that carrots improve intelligence. Okay, so I've described a little bit about how to write your research proposal. Just a couple of ideas. I'm sure that's something you could do yourself, but some of these guidelines could be useful. Probably a more important question to ask really is, who should be your supervisor? Because I think, as many of you would know from your past, finding the right supervisor is not only difficult, but it's critical in the sense that the supervisor plays so many different roles. And if you haven't developed a strong relationship with that person, it can be a very difficult degree to complete. So how do you know whether or not you have the right supervisor? Well, firstly, how do you find a supervisor? And so you can use the website. We do have a website. It's this particular URL there, scholars.uow.edu.au, and many of you would probably be on that page. You would include a search term, and that'll generate some potential researchers in your area, and they could be potential supervisors. But there are probably 2 methods that may be better for you. One is that we do also have a page that specifies what we call all the heads of postgraduate studies. These are sort of the PhD academic liaison for each of our 20 schools. And so one other task is to locate this page. It can be found fairly easily if you Google find a supervisor at UOW. And it'll list all of these heads of postgraduate studies, this academic head of each school. And you're welcome to contact that person for a potential supervisor. And so, for example, and I'll send you these slides, these slides can be sent later. This is a potential sort of email that you could write a supervisor if you wanted to, if you found someone who could be relevant. This is an email that you could write head of postgraduate studies, and you're welcome to use those words and just change them around for your purposes. It just saves a bit of time. Or, if you like, you're welcome to contact me as well. That's for anyone at UOW Malaysia or anyone watching this presentation. I'm happy for you to contact me, and I'll put my email in the chat box soon. In fact, before I do, maybe because it's a bit hard to do at the same time, I can just tell you my email, which is basically just Simon Mo, so SIMON So Simon, SIMONMO, and then at uow.edu.au. So uow.edu.au for Australia. And you're welcome to email me, and then I can at least put you in touch with the right head of postgraduate studies who can then identify a supervisor who might be most relevant to you. Okay, so once you've identified possible supervisors, they might suggest 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 names, both at this university, but maybe at other universities as well, in case you're considering other universities. Then you might think about, what are the qualities of a supervisor that I can evaluate now that will help me choose the right person? And these 4 photos represent sort of the 4 qualities you need to consider. And you might, even from the photos, see if you can guess what those qualities are. Okay. I'll give you a moment to do that, but I'll give you the answer. So firstly, I think you really want to find a supervisor, I believe, who seems humble, who, for example, when you email them and you have a conversation about your ideas, they seem genuinely interested, they want to know more, they don't pretend that they know everything about a topic. They may ask you questions, and they acknowledge that their own limitations, the fact that there's certain skills that they may not have developed. They may not be experts in a particular form of data analysis or whatever it might be. And because it's that humility and that openness and honesty that really promotes trusts, and I think inspires you to acknowledge your own limitations and develop sort of a genuine, supportive and productive relationship. I think also when you're emailing supervisors, you should assess the extent to which they respond within a day or so. For those supervisors who don't really respond within a week, I would be concerned. It would suggest to me that they may not generally respond promptly, and they're not sensitive enough to your needs, and they may be very rushed and therefore quite unhelpful. Whereas you really want someone who can respond, fairly in a timely fashion within a day or two. If they don't respond for a week or so, but then apologise later, and you sort of feel that's an aberrant situation, that's fine. But generally, I do think you're trying to find supervisors who can make time for their candidates. Some people, regardless of how busy they are, seem to make time. Some people are always rushed, even when they're not doing anything at all. And of course, you want a supervisor who listens to your ideas rather than imposes their own methods onto you. Of course, you want to be utilising their expertise and their knowledge and their ideas. And ideally, you'd want to almost integrate some of their skills into your research proposal. So you're utilising their advanced and extensive information and knowledge as well. But you certainly don't want a supervisor who essentially wants you to complete their work, who basically might treat you more as a research assistant rather than a colleague or someone they're trying to help and support and develop. And I think you very quickly get that sense, because even if it's a project that is somewhat aligned to the other person and you shift it slightly to be more similar to the supervisor's work, you still need to make sure that you have a sense of ownership over that project, that in some ways you've introduced some key choices and ideas into that project. Otherwise, your motivation is more likely to diminish over time. And finally, you can never be sure about the right supervisor, but sometimes you have a gut feeling about whether or not this is the right person for you. And in a nutshell, the research does seem to imply that that hunch, that feeling that someone is right, is often quite accurate. So do trust your hunches rather than ignore any sort of doubts, concerns, or qualifications you might have, or hesitation you might have about that person. And then to apply, it's fairly straightforward. This is actually, I think, the current URL link that you can use. It's a form that you need to complete. It's a little bit cumbersome, like all forms. And basically, to complete the form, you probably want to dedicate at least an hour, but even that's only after you've collected the relevant information. And the information you'll need is, I think you need, I'll have to check, but you certainly need copies of your academic transcripts. I think electronic copies if you have, or a certified copy, certified that it's original. and some copies of your passport, citizenship, and or permanent residency if you're living somewhere else. And you'll also need some evidence of English proficiency as well. And as I said, it takes about an hour to complete. And that's about all the slides I wanted to show. So I'm sort of more happy to open up to questions, and I'll try to turn off the shares. I can't remember if I'm not too sure if I'm still sharing. Oh, stop presenting. Yeah. So hopefully I'm not sharing anymore. And yeah, I'm sort of open to any questions. We can either discuss some questions now, like either in the chat box, or obviously you're welcome to unmute. Or instead, you're always welcome to email me and arrange a meeting at another time if you prefer. Yeah, so any questions? And by the way, I'm happy to wait a little bit. You know, we've still got plenty of time, so I'm happy to wait and listen to any ideas you might have, and also feel free to also raise any concerns or questions if you sort of feel that something is a little bit unsure or a bit uncertain about something. Then please raise that as well. As well as potentially, I'm also open to any suggestions you might have, so that we can support particular staff at UAW Malaysia more effectively in the future, either for next year or if you want to complete a PhD later, as well as any other questions you might have about the HDR program, such as potential collaborations. Okay, any other questions? I'll just write my email in here in case you're interested and you want to ask. That's my email there. That should be sent in a moment. But yes, please let me know if there's anything else you might need. And by the way, of course, if not, then you're welcome to leave, but might stay around just a little bit, just in case someone does want to ask a question. Often I find, I'm not too sure your experience, but my experience is usually that the most interesting part is when someone actually asks a question, usually aligns to what we're all thinking. Is there an option for us to do a PhD with you, Dave? Sorry, let me just open that. I'm just having a few problems with my mouse. Okay. All right. So the one question was, and thank you for digesting this information shared. Is there an option for us to complete the PhD with UAW, but the candidates are based in a home country like Malaysia? Yeah. So you can stay in Malaysia, and you can, as I say, continue your work in Malaysia and study part-time. So that's perfectly reasonable. There are obviously some restrictions or some implications. So the first would be that, you know, obviously there might not be the equipment you need. There may be the equipment you need, and if that's great, but obviously if there's equipment you need in Australia, you'd need to be in Australia. And of course, if you're studying in Malaysia and with UAW, then you won't have a student visa for Australia. And that might have some implications if, for example, you wanted to move to Australia in the future, you know, for example. And there are some protections of having a student visa. But if you don't have a student visa, you might not have some of those protections. Their protections more, of course, as change or whatever. They're not really as relevant. So basically in practice, if you think you can complete your research in Malaysia, that is, if you can access the relevant resources, and you're not ever sort of planning to move to Australia later, at least for long term, then I think it's perfectly reasonable to complete in Malaysia. You know, and you know, your supervisor could still be here. Of course, you could have one supervisor elsewhere as well. But no, it's perfectly reasonable to complete the PhD in Malaysia. All right. When approaching a potential supervisor, is it recommended to come with a specific issue topic or come with a few? Look, that depends on you, and it sort of depends on the supervisor. Look, my sense is that you know, you should just, if you're really wanting to think about a PhD, start that process I mentioned before of just starting to collect some ideas and thinking about a couple of possibilities. And of course, it doesn't have to be one. So yeah, I should have clarified that. So, you don't necessarily need to speak to the supervisor and say, I've got the one idea and this is it. You could certainly say, look, I've been thinking about these 2 or 3 different possibilities, because in some ways that gives the opportunity for the supervisor to contribute and to engage with you. Once they're engaged, they're much more likely to develop a conversation and, maybe therefore more likely to be interested in your work. So I think it's very reasonable to suggest maybe 2 or 3 different ideas. And of course, it's quite reasonable to also ask the supervisor for their own ideas. So to say, look, here's a couple of ideas I've been thinking about. Are there other projects that you would like me to pursue? And you wouldn't necessarily pursue them just but that could give you some ideas, because you might think, well, actually, I might be able to integrate the ideas of my supervisor with something else I was thinking about, or some other change I'd like to introduce. So in some ways, it is a bit of a conversation. You don't necessarily turn up with a ready-made project. Yeah. So oh, sorry, there's a bit of noise there, but I didn't mean to imply that you should have developed this whole research proposal by yourself. We're not expecting that much. You just want to think a little bit enough to get some ideas to excite your supervisor and to help you determine who may be an appropriate supervisor for you. Yeah. Any other questions? And I'll give you a little bit of time to think through. And of course, the secret to questions is try not to make them good questions, because often the questions that people really want to ask are the ones they're a bit embarrassed about asking because they think they should know. But often those things you think you should know may not have been explained so clearly. And I'm sort of quite happy to address anything that maybe I didn't explain particularly well. Any motivation for us who haven't started with PhD? Or did you? I mean, and just with that one, I just wouldn't like to say any motivation for us who haven't started with PhD. I wouldn't mind you just clarifying what you'd like me to talk about there. Yeah. Yeah, so I might have to think about that. Maybe clarify just a little bit about that. Planning to do the PhD with UAW Malaysia. Can I engage with the Australian supervisor? Yeah, there's no doubt. So I should mention that, of course, that you can engage with supervisors from actually any of the UAW campuses, and that's perfectly fine. And in fact, so that's something we encourage. We actually want more candidates, not just in Malaysia, but really across all of the campuses of UAW, to collaborate more across campuses. That's something that is being really promoted. Of course, you can also seek potentially a supervisor even outside UAW as well. Having said that, we do want at least 2 of your supervisors, so at least 2 supervisors ultimately, to be from UAW, so at least somewhere within UAW, whether it's in Malaysia, Australia, or Dubai, for example. But then if you want additional people on the panel, they can actually be members of other universities as well, provided they agree. People from Australia, UAW, will agree. People from other universities may agree if they're really interested in the work and they want to be involved. But just be aware, as you probably know, that supervisors often get some workload recognition for supervision. In other words, if they supervise more candidates, they may not have to teach as much or complete other responsibilities, but that provision may not apply if the students are not within the university. So it will apply in this case, anyone from UAW, but might not apply for supervisors from other universities potentially. Yeah, and Susie, did you want to sort of clarify your question about motivation for people who haven't started with a PhD? What is your suggestion on the use of AI tools to complete the PhD study? I'm actually happy later, if you'd like, to send some document I've created. I'd be very interested in your ideas, and it's a conversation we've had with some of you before about how we actually use something like ChatGPT or other AI tools to support the research. And my feeling is that, look, I think it's quite useful for the research proposal. So I would be quite happy for people to use ChatGPT to ask questions like, something you might write something like, I am working in the area of industrial engineering, for example. I'm sort of interested in a project that examines some of the latest trends. What is some popular research topics around this area? And then you might ask questions like, what theory, once you identify some of those interests, what theories should I read about that could be useful? And ask more questions about those theories, like, can you give me more advice about those theories? And even asking about methods. So, for example, if you need to measure something, so you might want to measure something like water quality, for example. I think it's quite reasonable to ask ChatGPT something. I'm sure many of you would have things like, what are some of the measures that have been developed to measure water qualities? Which are the most expensive or the least expensive measures? Which are the most valid measures? And those sorts of questions. And you might even then describe some of the data you might collect and ask ChatGPT to suggest some potential techniques that could be useful. Of course, where the limitations are is that, all right, we all know that ChatGPT can be wrong. It can often just make up information. So you obviously want to check the validity of its suggestions. You should never plagiarize from ChatGPT. So I would never use what it said verbatim. I would definitely change the words. We don't know what's going to be lawful in the future, but we have to be careful because something you might do now may not be lawful in the future, and you might be stuck with it. So I would never use ChatGPT literally. I would never, as in copy and paste. And certainly don't upload anything into ChatGPT like data or anything like that, as you would know. But otherwise, I think it can be useful. It's a really fascinating conversation, Jasmine. I'm sure you have lots of your own ideas, and I'd be interested to hear those. I think it's creating problems for a number of reasons, which is that in some ways, although it's supposed to greatly accelerate our research, it does mean that some tasks are becoming almost too easy. And so we're not as engaged in thinking and trying to understand. And that can really compromise our memory and critical thinking and development. So I think there are lots of challenges with AI, such as ChatGPT, that we're going to have to manage, but we haven't quite worked our way through that yet. We're still grappling. So we still see it as a tool that is very useful, potentially. It's obviously something that we need to use because it's going to be important as the world evolves. And we're only now sort of learning some of the limitations. Thank you. Yeah, but yeah, Jasmine, I'm really interested in your views. I'm happy to send you some notes that we've developed around the use of ChatGPT for research. And so I'd be really interested in your perspective as well. And that's something maybe we can sort of develop some guidelines collectively over time. No problem at all. Any other questions? As I say, I'll stick around for a while, but let me know if there's anything else you might need. Yep, no problem at all. Yes, I might even ask Mohammed or someone to even email me sometime, and I'll send some information about ChatGPT and anything else that people want. So maybe contact him first, and about anything any other information or resources you might need, and I'm happy to provide that over email as well. Any other questions? Just to reduce the pain of everyone, I might assume that if I don't hear a question for, say, I don't know, 2 or 3 more minutes, that there's no more questions, and we can call to an end. But is there a website to UAW staff to read more about studying the PhD? Details about tuition fees. Look, I think everything you need to know should be in the area where you look up UAW and then Graduate Research School. As I mentioned, if you're a UAW staff member, so like UAW Malaysia or any UAW staff member, then you certainly don't need to pay tuition fees. There'll be no tuition fees. And actually, we're also quite open to ideas. So, for example, if you are a UAW staff in Malaysia or elsewhere, and you feel that there's something you don't like about the existing system, then please let us know, because I think we're trying to develop those relationships stronger over time. That's one of the reasons why we've waived tuition fees for staff at UAW, but there might be other constraints you're experiencing, and we might be able to revisit those as well. As long as it's something that doesn't compromise the quality of the PhD, we might find other ways in which we can accommodate your particular needs as well. No problem. Okay, so I might, unless there are questions in the next couple of minutes, I might call it to an end. As I said, please let me know if you need anything more, or if there's anyone else you'd like to meet. I'm always happy to organise, arrangements with particular individuals. And if you're still not sure for a while, I do hope to be visiting Malaysia in the next year or so. That might not happen, at least for a while. But yeah, soon I do hope to visit and maybe learn a little bit more about circumstances at the various campuses in Malaysia. Okay. All right. I think that might do for now. All the best. Good luck for the future, and I hope to be hearing from more of you soon. And please let me know if you need to know anything else. Thank you. No problem at all. Great. Thanks, everyone. Hope you have a good day.